Welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn Blog, and tonight we're talking about a television show called Adolescence, which I have seen and in many ways enjoyed. But it's come in for a lot of the criticism because while it is not as obvious in its moralizing as you would expect an American liberal propaganda show to be, it still is effectively moralizing. Now, I've said some things in the past that from my anecdotal experience, I have seen young boys in some of my classes talk about Andrew Tate and Pareto Optimum. They don't really talk about dating. Hopefully it's because I'm a teacher, but also they don't really seem to be dating all that much. But I'm teaching younger students right now. When I teach seniors, there's a little bit of dating, but less than there used to be. And again, this is all anecdotal. Although, to be fair, the stats I've seen on the matter do back it up. But I wanted to get into Adolescence because in some ways I think it was responding to a kind of moral panic that is based on something real, but hard to fully understand exactly how much of it is going on, even with the anecdotes I just shared. And that brings me to two things I've read from The Future of Everything, a post on Adolescence by Tim Dunlop, and then a post on Moral Panics by Simon Copland. And we're going to read and discuss both. That's what we do here in Radical Engagements. And let's get into it. I'm going to post this a little faster than I normally do because I have no idea how long this is going to stay in the zeitgeist. So we're going to have to get this turned around faster than a couple months, right? Let's get into it. Let me as larger as you can see it here. And with all these things, I would tell you to actively pursue reading this and reading The Future of Everything, at least in the free version. Start with a quote. As controllers of robots perpetuate long-distance violence, lightweight, rapid-fire, semi-automatic guns designed for military conflict are brought into the American schools to settle petty personal scores and fits of youthful rage. War zone equipment has become a violent personal accessory. The Cambridge History of World Violence, Volume 4, 1800 to the present. Ominous. Let's get into Dunlop's words. The Netflix limited series, Adolescence, is an incredible piece of television. I agree, I actually liked it. But I feel like I have watched a different show to the one all the rave reviews are raving about. Nearly all the focus in them is on the way in which a particular sort of internet culture has corrupted an otherwise innocent and normal teenage boy. Asterisk. I think that this is a problem of the way this was spun. I also think the authors intended it, but I actually didn't read this as the corruption of a normal teenage boy, but an influenced teenage boy with abnormal tendencies in a normal-ish family in Britain. And the Britishness of it is important, as is the normal-ish family. But let's go on. And therefore, otherwise normal and innocent surrounding society, somehow driving him to commit a heinous crime. To my way of thinking, though, what the show actually presents is a world of male violence that existed long before misogyny was digitized. For instance, I thought the review of the show in The New Yorker was great, but when author Doreen St. Felix writes, Adolescence lives in a paranoid world that Andrew Tate made, I was surprised. Tate and those like him may well be a part of the problem, but this is in no way a world they created. No, they're the most extreme, obvious form of this world, which is to say, such reviews are focusing on the wrong thing, panicking culturally about internet culture without addressing the culture of which the internet itself is a part. After all, the internet reflects culture as much as drives it. This is true for most media. Yes, it is in a feedback loop. Yes, media has a role to play, but the idea that media is setting the cultural norms and is the expression of the hegemony of whatever class society, tends to ignore that the hegemony already exists outside of the media. So there you go. I don't want to play down the role of that online culture, and the internet may well be a force multiplier, as was books before it, by the way. If you read about the some of the stuff that happened when we invented the printing press, it was a similar thing, which is an absolute problem in itself. But to me, it feels more like a symptom than a cause. Look at the way the program begins. A highly militarized group of police, decked out in body armor and assault weaponry, show up in force at a suburban home and bust into it to make an unannounced arrest. Whatever arguments you can make about the efficacy of such approach, this is a show of overwhelming force. It is a perfect illustration of the legitimized state violence that governs our world, particularly in the West. Such an action might be shocking to most of us, but it's normalized and clearly presented as something against which we have no recourse. The police telling the homeowners, the boy's parents, that they might be due some compensation for the mess if they lodge the right request underlies not just the violence of what just happened, but the disparity of power inherent in the whole process in which violence is embedded. I'm not so convinced that the filmmakers of Adolescence don't know that, but I do think it's a valid point. The officers at the police station who handle the former arrest process and set in the train the whole legal machinery in which the family is now inextricably enmeshed may well behave decently, even with some compassion, but it is clear that all the decency could disappear in a heartbeat if any resistance was shown. Our objections were voiced in the wrong way. The entire procedure and its attendant decency are underpinned by the threat of violence we have already seen unleashed at the boy's house. This is normal, right? Reasonable, just the way things are. Many reviews have concentrated on the episode set in Jamie's school, and it's worthy of attention, not because it is one of the most acutely highlights the role of social media, but it's the most chilling episode to me as episode 3, the one which involves the forensic psychologist, Bronnie Ariston, who comes to speak to Jamie Miller, the boy at the center of the drama, played brilliantly by Owen Cooper. And the acting in this was amazing, I will admit that. From the opening of the episode, we are again inside a system of legitimized violence. This place is a mental health facility for boys charged with crimes, and it is freighted with uniformed staff and walls of surveillance screens. Bronnie is there to make an independent pre-sentence offense report, which the judge will read in order to get an understanding of you and your understanding of the charges. It is her 5th visit, and that alone speaks to the level of control being applied. We are told that she is the only one. She's only one in number of psychologists to assess Jamie. She's only one of a number of psychologists to assess Jamie, which again underlies the regimented and pathologized nature of Jamie's situation, into which our society is geared up to deal with young offenders like Jamie. As Bronnie checks in with the head guard, we hear screams from the other cells. An alarm goes off. The staff rushes through the corridors to deal with an incident, past Bronnie on her way to see Jamie. There's also shown footage of a fight which Jamie has been involved in, and we see him beating the shit out of another young inmate, establishing beyond a doubt his propensity for violence. It is the sort of physical violence you only learn by doing. Where did Jamie learn this? And I actually thought about that when I watched the show. I was wondering if they were going to implicate the father, which they kind of do and also kind of don't. We'll get to that. What follows is an intense series of interactions between Jamie and Bronnie, in which he veers from sweetly manipulative to openly violent, yelling at her, physically threatening her, smashing a cup of hot chocolate she brought him. During their exchange, she quizzes him not only about his views on masculinity, but also about his relationship with his father, played by the world's greatest actor, Stephen Graham. I do like Stephen Graham. I don't know if he's the world's greatest actor, but I'm quite fond of him. Anyway, Jamie tells the story of his father destroying a shed in the backyard one day when he was angry about something, though Jamie is defensive of him and rationalizes the whole incident as an aberration. It may well have been, but it is clear that he understands the violence his father is capable of. And that comes back up in the show, actually. And it should be clear that his father wasn't groomed to this sort of violence by Andrew Tate videos. No, he was not. The whole episode is harrowing, and Bronnie is left completely devastated as Jamie is finally led away. To what extent the episode is an accurate representation of how such exchanges would happen in real life, I don't know. But as presented, you can't help but feel that it was part of a situation that perpetuates and even encourages the very violence it is set up to diagnose and document. I mean, that's most institutions, to be quite frank. The irony of institutions is something I keep pointing out. Schools are sell that they're creating a more equal and meritocratic world, but they sort people. There's no way around that. Anything involving police enforcement is going to be predicated on violence at a fundamental level. Even if you agree with it, it's still predicated on violence at a fundamental level. So these are things you do have to kind of process. Like, the people who protect us from violence are also very violent people, and they're part of a violent system. Maybe they aren't protecting us from violence all that much. Hard to say. Anyway, the institutionalized violence, because that's what it is, has little to do with any online culture and is instead embedded deeply in the sorts of societies we have established, even when we are attempting to bring some nuance and humanity to the issues of crime and punishment. For me, though, the most telling part of the episode is not the exchanges between Bronnie and Jamie, but the two brief encounters between Bronnie and the head guard. From the moment she arrives, this man is leering, not quite threatening presence. His exchanges with Bronnie are drenched in British class consciousness, his own obvious feelings of inferiority in regard to her professional status, his desperation to impress her, and a thinly veiled sexual attraction. I say not quite threatening in that sense that, paradoxically, the institutional conditions in which they meet constrain any temptation he might have to take things further. He is presented as creepy in the show. Nonetheless, he makes his presence felt, and Bronnie is clearly uncomfortable with every single moment they spend together. During their final encounter, when she is standing at the video screen observing Jamie, now that he has been left alone, the guard stands right at her shoulder, trying to impress her with the fact that he's read a book about body language. "What are you seeing?" he asked, almost whispering, accentuating their physical closeness. I mean, what was it you're looking for? Is it body language stuff? She doesn't answer, so he continues. I'm reading a book on that at the moment. He shifts position, moving closer. She jumps when he speaks. He is so close. "My sister gave it to me. See people hide," he says. "You know, I don't need to tell you this, but they hide so much." He is completely plaintive, almost whispering in her ear, almost crying. You can't help but think. Maybe they tell the truth, but their bodies, their faces, he says. She shuts him down, tries to continue her job of observing, so he changes tack. He becomes more personal, tells her that he couldn't do what she does, and she responds in kind. And then it is a banter from him about swapping jobs, vacation times, pay grades. Ingratiating. She tells him she likes her job most of the time. "Well, I hate mine," he says. She leaves and he hugs the door jamb to the office, watching her all the way down the corridor. The whole encounter is creepy as fuck, and I think it says as much about the underlying themes of the show as any other segment. In fact, the entire series appears to me to be less about specific online culture and its corrupting possibilities than the way in which women are forced, as a matter of course, to management's anger, not to mention their ever-present sexual overtures. The exchanges between Bronnie and the guard are all that writ large are writ small. They're writ small, and all the more powerful for it. I think this reading is fair. I would add, though, the class consciousness stuff implies something else too. One of the things I found interesting about Adolescence is that pretty much every member of society is implicated in some way or another. Bronnie's implicated, the guard's implicated, the father's implicated, the mother's implicated, the sister's kind of not, but only kind of. The community in which they live in is implicated. Even the murder victim is implicated, which I haven't actually seen that discussed that much. So, this doesn't surprise me. And it is creepy, and it's also pathetic. In that way in which someone doing something very uncouth and very menacing, but also is in a situation where you might have natural sympathy for them. I don't know if Tim does, but I did. Is a very real kind of thing when you look at people who can otherwise be quote creepy as fuck and legitimately so. All right. All right. But they're also present in the ways in which Jamie's mother and sister are forced to navigate Jamie's father's moods. They're all suffering because of Jamie's crime, but somehow as a father, feelings that are paramount and have to be catered to. As I say, it is an incredible show, but we are kidding ourselves if we try and dump all the blame for the sorts of violence it examines onto internet culture. Absolutely kidding ourselves. Well, it's very easy to blame the internet for making things inherent in human uh, life more obvious. After all, if it wasn't speaking to both male loneliness and real violence in the overall society, a lot of that shit would have no purchase on TikTok or Instagram anyway. I think one of the things we haven't liked about social media is it makes the feedback loop a cacophonous noise, which can only be distilled somewhat haphazardly in these kinds of artistic shows. And I agree that there's implications here about the father, about the father's emotional regulation, about women being sources of emotional regulation. That's all very astutely um, pulled out. I have nothing to criticize on this, but I do think it's interesting because I think the show, and I don't know if Tim would disagree with this. I don't know Tim Dunlop. Also does want you to kind of understand where even these like flawed and potentially dangerous male characters are coming from, with maybe the exception of Jamie, who, other than the way he is treated in the episode 1 with the cops, which he's legitimately terrified of, and which uh, things go from like SWAT team to trying to comfort a child who's done something horrible. That's the only time you really get any sympathy for that character. You don't spend that much time in his head. You spend time in the school with the psychologist, with the father, and the family afterwards. I think that's interesting, and I think it says a lot about a lot of different things. Let's get to the other article that pairs with it, because I think it's a little bit more not substantive, but developed. Oh, wrong one. So now we're going to go to Moral Panic in the Manosphere by Simon Copland. Discussion of Netflix Adolescence by the author and researcher Simon Copland. I might reach out to him. I'm going to be interested in talking about the male complaint. My recent piece about the Netflix show Adolescence generated a lot of interesting discussion, and I've been wanting to follow up on the broader topic. Fortunately, contributor Simon Copland has offered this article, drawing on his research into online misogyny. Simon has a new book coming out in May called The Male Complaint, The Manosphere, and Misogyny Online, which I am looking forward to reading. In the meantime, I am pleased to publish his discussion about the show that everyone is talking about. All right, let's go in there. So that was Tim Dunlap talking to Simon Copland. Now we're going to get into Simon Copland's words. After the release of Adolescence, discussion of Manosphere launched into the stratosphere. It seems to launch into the stratosphere about every 3 years. Even before we got Gamergate a decade and some change ago, it would come up. I think, and it's not, I don't want to come down on the British here because Americans are probably worse about this. We tend to forget these cycles of male sympathy and then calling out male violence. Anyway, the show has been an absolute phenomenon, and despite the Manosphere playing a relatively minor role within the actual series, I agree. It was like it's hinted at in the second episode, and yeah, it has dominated the post-release analysis, as Selena Ribeiro says, quote, the portrait of adolescent boys is angry, under-socialized, and vulnerable to deeply misogynistic methods, and influencers has unnerved and horrified adolescents' audiences. Ribeiro points out what some have called adolescence wake-up call for all of us. I hate when we think these things are going to be wake-up calls. But as she asks, quote, have the alarm bells turned alarmist? When does a wake-up call become a moral panic? And how concerned should we be? I don't know, intermediately concerned, in my opinion, but also a lot of this stuff already exists, so let's get there. I want to ask a similar question to those Ribeiro considers in her excellent article reflecting on the responses to the show, but my aim here is to provide a different perspective on these questions. What is a moral panic? A moral panic is a widespread feeling of intense fear and concern in society about a particular group or activity that is perceived as a threat to social values or interests. This feeling is often exaggerated or disproportionate to the actual risk, and in many instances, the risk doesn't even exist at all, with fear spreading over a completely manufactured threat. This can be driven by media coverage and in the 21st century by social media as well, which just makes media coverage more interactive and more responsive to social criticism. I actually do think one of the advantages of social media is that it shoots down a lot of the bullshit talking points that will like take over cable news shows and newspapers for months and months and months at a time. That was my experience of the 90s and aughts when I was a teenager and in college. So there you go. Stanley Cohen describes it best in his book, Folk Devils and Moral Panics, in a quote worth repeating in full. Societies appear to be subject every now and then to periods of moral panic. A condition, episode, person, or a group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to social values and interests. Its nature is presented in a stylized and stereotypical fashion by the mass media. The moral barricades are manned by editors, bishops, politicians, and other right-thinking people. Socially accredited experts pronounce their diagnosis and solutions. Ways of coping are evolved or more often resorted to. The condition then disappears, submerges, or deteriorates, and becomes more visible. Sometimes the object of panic is quite novel, and at other times it is something which has been in existence long enough, but it certainly appears in the limelight. I think it's more often the latter, but yeah. Sometimes more panics pass over and is forgotten, except in folklore and collective memory. And at other times, it is more serious and long-lasting repercussions and might produce such changes in the legal and social policy or even in the way society conceives itself. The satanic panic is probably the best example to help us understand the concept. I do love British spelling. I know I hate on the English a lot, but I do love British spelling. Let's get back on topic, though. This centered on a completely unsubstantiated allegations of satanic ritual abuse, which entire towns being swept up with fear that children were victims of widespread satanic networks. People went to prison for this. This was actually going on when I was a kid. I had Michelle Remembers in my fucking house. My mother owned it. Allegations were targeted at parents and daycare centers, which children often coerced into giving evidence against their own carers. The panic was fueled by sensation media coverage and conspiracy theories, leading to a range of false accusations, long trials, and wrongful conditions against many. And man, the backlash on this, because it starts in progressive circles. We actually studied the satanic panic. It starts in progressive circles about liberalizations of dealing with abusers and the side effects of that, turning it over to therapeutic models. And then it moves throughout the general zeitgeist really fast with Michelle Remembers and all that stuff coming out in the late 70s. Also with a lot of the 70s Exorcist movies and this, that, and the other. And it goes through the D&D book burning craze. I mean, I've talked about this before, but I read Anne Rice as a middle schooler. My mom had a first pressing of Interview with the Vampire, and she had it not because she bought it like when it came out. And during this time period, I think this was like 1992. I had a Baptist friend who I loaned the books to, and they got burnt in a church book burning. about the Satanic Panic, as did a lot of D&D stuff that was around. Mine I didn't loan out, so I kept it. My D&D stuff, by the way, it was always fun because I would find it in flea markets. Anyway, I'm getting too nostalgic. Let's get back here. But I do think, the Satanic Panic is fascinating. I think we're seeing a renewed quasi-Satanic Panic, which the right wing coming back into victory is weirdly stopping. Question mark? Maybe, I don't know. We'll see how it goes. It is hard to tell how bad things are. Yes, it is often hard to tell how bad things are. Asking the questions are responses to the Manosphere version of a moral panic. I've actually asked that to myself a lot. Okay, not just in this response, but in general. Is a difficult question for me to ask. I've been studying the Manosphere for 7 years now, and I've written a PhD and a book about the community. Asking this question really makes me wonder, have I wasted all these years? I wonder that all the time. Have I wasted all these years teaching you things? Have I wasted all my years as a teacher? Anyway. But I think it is a useful way to examine how we respond to this community, and particularly how serious we need to take it. So let's ask a question: is the Manosphere that bad? Which part of it? As a researcher on this phenomenon, journalists often ask me, do you have any statistics on how widespread the Manosphere is? And while some research shows the Manosphere is having some influence on the views of young men, particularly through social media, that I've seen more recent research that says that as well. In general, I have to answer no. We have no real data on how many boys engage in these channels, what groups they may align to, or even good data on the spread of misogynistic ideas, particularly compared to other time frames. We weren't following this in the past. It's not like there hasn't been plenty of misogyny in popular culture at other times. There are a couple of things worth looking at, however, which can help point to the scale and impact of the community. First, is the obvious huge following it has online. When I was researching the Manosphere, I was studying a relatively niche subreddits on Reddit, the largest of which had over 300,000 followers. This was before Andrew Tate became a megastar in the community, expanding its reach and making it much more of a household term. Nonetheless, this has come with a caveat. I have also found that while subreddits have a huge following, only a tiny percentage of people actively participate in them. Subscribe rates, as with the viewing rates on Tate videos, is not a clear indicator of belief in the community. I mean, people sometimes hate watch that shit. I don't know why people hate watch stuff. But you're welcome to hate watch me. It increases my numbers. But I don't know why people hate watch stuff, because you make it more popular in this day and age. The most worrying of these has been a spate of violent misogynistic attacks, with the self-described incel Elliot Rogers leading the charge, with the Isla Vista killings in 2014 in California. The Manosphere men have also led campaigns of online harassment, such as the Thought Audit, in which men reported sex workers to the IRS. Pickup artists are also teaching men manipulative and coercive techniques to pick up women. That's not new. I discovered that in my 20s. All right, with some artists even doing videoing themselves doing it, even if the impact of these tactics is not widespread, and it's increasingly difficult to argue that they are, in and of themselves, they are worth worrying about. The moral panic comes from elsewhere. So, are we dealing with a moral panic or not? To answer this, let's go back to the definition from Stanley Cohen, who says that a moral panic occurs when persons or a group of persons emerges to become defined as a threat to societal values and interests. I feel like we can talk about that with incel. This part of the definition has made me reflect on the most interesting part of the responses to the rise of the Manosphere. It has been fascinating to watch people talk about the Manosphere as if it was something new, an explosion of misogyny unlike anything society has ever seen before. Yeah, I've thought that too. I was like, no, this is not new. It's not new at all. Man, did people kind of pretend that there was no world before 2008, but in America anyway. Let's get back to Donna Zuckerberg, the sister of the Meta founder Mark. I wonder how she feels about how things are going to him now. For example, wrote in her book about the Manosphere. I haven't read her book about the Manosphere. I have read her book about outright appropriations of the classics, and I thought it was okay. That's all I have to say about that. All right. Social media has led to an unprecedented democratization of information, just like, the printing press did. But it has also created the opportunity for men with anti-feminist ideas to broadcast their views to more people than ever before and to spread conspiracy theories, lies, and misinformation. Why do we assume that like cable news wasn't spreading conspiracy theories, lies, and misinformation when they were behind shit like pushing the satanic panic in local media? All right, but anyway. And again, I remember it. I'm that old. Social media has elevated misogyny to entirely new levels of violence and virulence. This quote is written as if it is just common sense, that social media has created a wave of misogyny that is a threat to our non-misogynistic social values. But take a step back, however, and you realize how laughable that statement is. Violent misogyny has sadly existed and spread well before the rise of social media and the manosphere. Duh. And given our current social circumstances, would likely continue to exist if these platforms collapse tomorrow. Also, duh. But let's go on. Zuckerberg's claim seems to forget the witch trials in which women were literally burned at the stake in campaigns of misogynistic violence, usually in Protestant countries. It also forgets the fact that in living memory, women were still fighting for rape to be illegal in marriage. That's definitely true. And not long before, they were battling for the vote. Each of these campaigns faced significant backlash, much of which was violent. So while the Manosphere may be presenting misogyny in a new way, misogyny is not new at all. This is where I think we can point more clearly to this being a moral panic. The moral panic comes not from the fear of misogyny, but from the belief that this is out of sorts or different from mainstream society. This is important as it is making it seem like the manosphere is an aberration created by social media. An aberration created by social media allows us, and particularly political and social leaders, to ignore the very real and underlying social and economic factors that has given rise to it. Good call, Dr. Copland. All right, Copland. While the violence of Jamie, the main character in Adolescence, is rightfully put under a microscope, the other violence throughout the show goes largely unexamined or is assumed to be normal. I'm not sure I agree with you there, but I agree that that's the way people have responded to the show. I'm not sure that the show is unaware of the violence implicit in a lot of the other scenes. Anyway, let's get back to this. In the first episode, Jamie's family home is torn apart by police officers who conduct a raid at dawn. In the third episode, a creepy security guard lectures on Jamie's psychologist during her shift. But this violence and behavior is not questioned, and I think deliberately by the show producers. It is assumed and normalized, with only Jamie's violence being treated as aberrant and worthy of the panic of the community. I think it is presented as routine and normalized. I do not think that it doesn't actually implicate those actions in Jamie's actions. I think those things are there deliberately. They might not be focused on deliberately too. I mean, but anyway, I don't want to sound like I'm a simp for the show because there's obviously problems with it. For example, I mean most of the killers of women in this kind of scenario, and we should include like 70s and 80s serial killers as like uber misogyny as part of this. They're not middle school boys, which is not to say this doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen a lot. All right, let's put it another way. If what the Manosphere was promoting was state violence or even domestic violence, the panic would not be there. This is because that violence is just assumed to be normal and therefore not worth panicking about. Taking this one step further, I would argue that the Manosphere is just a manifestation of such violence. Without such assumed misogyny and violence, thank you, I actually agree doing this, the Manosphere leaders would not have a basis under which to grow. The only reason they've caused such a panic is that they're taking this violence into new realms, ones that are outside the assumptions of where violence can and should happen. This leads us to the second problem with the Manosphere's new attitude. In positing that the Manosphere this way, commenters have successfully been able to make it a problem about someone else, a group over there and away from society, primarily teenage boys. All the talk about the Manosphere is focused on teenage boys, and of course, it is not a surprise that Adolescence focused on a young boy as well. But it is worth noting that the Manosphere is not just made up of young men or even just men. One of the most prominent groups in the community, for example, Men Going Their Own Way, which, by the way, does have a political party in Florida, is primarily comprised of 40 and 50-something divorced men. Imagine that. As a divorced man, imagine that. That said, the gender dynamics don't actually fit, in my case, to the norm. Who have left or been left from bad relationships and have decided that their turmoil is representative of the horribleness of women in their entirety. Yeah. Not great. Some of the most famous Manosphere advocates are women, such as Australia's own Bettina Arndt. By creating a scapegoat, the more panic allows powerful actors in society to actually increase violence, not reduce it. Okay, full quote. While some studies have shown that young boys are now more conservative compared to their elder counterparts on the questions of feminism, yeah, although that might not last. That was also true for millennials in the early aughts, by the way. People forget that. But anyway, much of this is still relative. Take a group of 50 or 60-year-old men, and I can guarantee that they would have been far more sexist as teens compared to most teens now. Abso-fucking-lutely. I remember what it was like growing up in the 90s. The low-key misogyny and a lot of other things was pretty much everywhere. As Michael Salter argues, the idea that young men today are more misogynistic than they were 20 or 30 years ago, I don't see any evidence for this. And I don't either. We just don't have evidence like showing up on TikTok all the time. In blaming teenage boys, we also risk absolving ourselves of responsibility. Bing, 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 bing. Absolutely. If young boys are becoming more conservative, we only have ourselves to blame. Yep. Are the Democrats both? We adults are the ones who've created this society and are therefore the ones who should be held responsible for the views these young men are holding. Well, I do think young men have to take some responsibility for themselves. We do live in a society. Michael Salter, I think, explains this best. He says, fundamentally, we need to approach children as children. We need to take responsibility as adults for the social context in which we force children to grow up in. If there's a problem with their behavior, that's because of us. Cough, cough. Because we're the adults in the room, they're children. I mean, some of us are the adults in the room. They don't take responsibility for massive social problems like violence against women. But in the moral panic of the Manosphere, this is not what is happening. Instead, we are scapegoating young boys for expressing the misogynistic views that we have taught them through our violent and sexist systems, media, and politics. Sure. And the scapegoating is dangerous. As Stuart Hall argues in Policing the Crisis, I do love some Stuart Hall. Good old British Marxism. Anyway, the moral panic appears to us to be one of the principal forms of ideological consciousness, bing, by which the means of a silent majority is won over to the support of increasingly coercive measures on the part of the state and lends its legitimacy to the more than usual existence of control. By creating a scapegoat, the moral panic allows powerful actors in society to actually increase violence, not reduce it. Control and violence as long as it is targeted towards the group who is apparently behind this attack on social values. While we're not necessarily at that level of coercion and violence just yet, we can already see the seeds of it in response to the Manosphere. Instead of tackling the social and economic foundation of this movement, politicians and social commentators alike, including liberal and leftist ones, most especially liberals and leftist ones, but also, conservative ones too, actually, are talking about new school programs for boys or even more policing and surveillance. Most worrying is the talk of cracking down on misogyny through anti-terror legislation, a favorite gambit of moral panics. The very same legislation that has been rightfully criticized for significantly undermining people's civil rights and furthering racist violence in Western countries. Yeah. As this happens, the misogynistic violence that underpins our society goes unchecked. Police continue to perpetuate high levels of domestic violence, very high levels in the U.S. countries continue to support evil wars, and politicians get away with making openly misogynistic statements, all of this will be accepted, while the very same people will shake their heads concerningly at their round tables when they talk about the very serious threat of teenage misogyny. Yes, this is a moral panic. So yes, this is a moral panic. But the moral panic is not about misogyny. Misogyny is real, it is scary, and it must be dealt with. The moral panic instead comes through the ridiculous but strangely common view that this misogyny is new. Some sort of manifestation of the internet has made things bad for women out of the blue. It wasn't beginning with Gay Brigade, guys. The moral panic comes from scapegoating teenage boys who are increasingly being blamed for all of society's ills. And making this moral panic, we are not just excusing ourselves from our role in creating this problem, we are also making it impossible to deal with, which is to say we can't deal with the manosphere unless we tackle those underlying problems. But that means recognizing that the community is not an aberration, it is us. Recognizing that many, sadly, may be a bit too far for some. And I've seen this a lot, like the quote, men need to go to therapy epidemic, like how they get therapy. Like when you're talking about working class men going to therapy when like 1/8 of them aren't even employed, but in good economic times because of disability and whatnot. And that's all about to get worse in the US because of changes in the laws. So if anyone thought things were going to get easier for young men and blue collar men in particular, no, not going to happen anytime real soon. Even though they're super angry and maybe supported Trump more than normal, they're mad now even at that because they're getting screwed again. I'm not here to say pity to poor men because I also agree misogynistic attitudes and violence against women are been a low grade thing everywhere my entire life. You know, I've written about this before. There was times where two friends of mine convinced me to help transport people to women's shelters, and I learned a lot about violence against women by doing that. It's also one of the few times where I actively carried a gun. So, you know, yeah, this ain't new at all. But it would be nice to pretend it's new, wouldn't it? Want to give Simon Copland and Tom Dunlop credit for posting this. I think there's other problems with the adolescent narrative. I thought it was a good show that was pretty accurate about society, like The Wire was, but you know, British and more limited. But even The Wire has pretty big limitations. We have to deal with why this stuff is attractive and not just go all the time that everyone who might fall into this does so just out of their own personal attitudes. Personal attitudes absolutely have to be tamed, and when people fall into true incel land, there's very little you can do to pull them out. Like most ideological cul-de-sacs, it has defense mechanisms. It's hard to take down. But the idea that this is all very new, no, it's not. Protect your peace and be honest about what society's actually like. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. We have more behind the Patreon wall. $4 gets you access to all audio. $6 gives you access to additional video, and $10 to $15, which is the highest I'm willing to take on an ask, a month will get you say and patrons only material. Any level can get you access to the Discord and book clubs that I run. Actually, my community runs more than I do. I run 2 of them. One of them is a show on the main channel called Excavations. I also run one called the Theory Reading Group, which is mostly dealing with sociological and historical theory, believe it or not like critical theory, although we're totally willing to go there. Yeah, we have more. I had to buy a new computer because of complications of memory and AI to make better videos for you. And my Patreon allowed that to happen. And I thank you all for that. Yeah. Thus ends the rentier part of the show. Protect your peace so seriously and maybe be a little bit more introspective. Take care.